Taylor Swift and Matty Healy's relationship lasted barely a month. It came together incredibly fast, and then he disappeared. But when I looked at their synastry, I found something I wasn't expecting. Because buried in this chart are asteroids connected to an impossible dream, sudden escape, and even a love story that ends in grief and becomes poetry and music. So, what happened here? Why did something that burned this brightly disappear almost as quickly as it began? And why did a relationship that lasted such a short time appear to leave such a massive emotional and creative footprint? Because when you start putting these asteroids together, the story of this relationship is written into the chart. Now, her Tantalus and Healy asteroids conjunct his Neptune and Saturn. In mythology, Tantalus is the image of wanting what is right there in front of you and somehow never being able to possess it. The fruit hangs above your head, but you can't quite reach it. So in Synastry, Tantalus can describe that maddening feeling of, I can almost have you. And since her Tantalus is sitting with her Healy asteroid, his own last name, it perfectly describes the situation between the two of them. Now put her Tantalus and Healy on his Neptune. Neptune idealizes and romanticizes. It creates fantasy and projection. So Matty, or what he represents to her, can become the unreachable dream. She can see the dream. She can feel it. But why can't she actually have it? And that is where Saturn comes in. Because her Tantalus is also conjunct his Saturn. Now, Saturn is the restriction. Saturn rules Father Time. So now there can be waiting, delays, obstacles, something standing between the desire and actually being able to live it. Neptune makes him the dream. Saturn makes the dream difficult to attain, and Tantalus keeps reaching, never being able to reach the fruit. Sometimes the fact that you can't quite have something is exactly what keeps the longing alive. His union, Don Quixote and Valentine, are conjunct her south node. And Don Quixote is especially interesting here because we're seeing that impossible dream theme again. Don Quixote is the archetype of the man chasing something that may never exist in the form he imagines it. He believes in the dream. He fights for the dream, and sometimes he sees what he wants to see rather than what is actually standing in front of him. Now put that on her south node, along with Union and Valentine. The south node can feel incredibly familiar in synastry. It's something we already recognize. There's often this feeling of, I've been here before. I know you. I know this story. And look at what's sitting there. Union, coming together. Valentine, which is romantic love. Don Quixote, chasing the impossible dream. So there is something about him that can activate an old romantic story in her. The feeling of a union that seems strangely familiar and yet somehow tied to an impossible ideal. And once again, we're getting the same message from completely different asteroids. Tantalus reaches for the unattainable fruit. Don Quixote chases the impossible dream. Her amour, Phaeton, and her name asteroid, Taylor, are conjunct his Mercury in Aries. And Phaeton is really interesting here as well. In mythology, Phaeton takes control of the sun god's chariot, but he can't control it. He flies too high and then too low. Everything gets out of control, and eventually the whole thing comes crashing down. So Phaeton can represent something that takes off very quickly, but becomes difficult to control once it's in motion. And hers is sitting right on his Mercury in Aries. Mercury rules communication, what we say, what we think, and Aries Mercury is already fast and impulsive. It can speak first and think about the consequences later. But look at what else Taylor puts there. Amor, which is love, and Taylor, her own name. So Taylor herself, her feelings of love, and this Phaeton story of something racing forward and eventually losing control are all activating his mind and his communication. And we're not even at the part of the chart yet that shows us what happens when it comes crashing down. Now, her Hypnos and Agapanor are conjunct his south node. Hypnos is the god of sleep. So when I see Hypnos strongly activated in Synastry, there can be a hypnotic quality to the connection. It's like falling under someone's spell. And remember, this is happening on his south node. So she is activating something in him that can feel strangely familiar, almost as though he's being pulled backward into something he already knows. Agapanor is one of those asteroids I watch when somebody seems to act as a bridge from one chapter of another person's life into the next. So she comes into his life with this hypnotic, strangely familiar south node quality. But she is also someone who is moving him from one chapter of his life into another. And sometimes the person who changes the direction of your story isn't necessarily the person who stays there for the rest of it. Now, before I go any further, I need to explain something about Taylor's birth time, because there are two different birth times reported for her. I'm working with the 8:36 a.m. chart, but there is also a 5:17 a.m. birth time that has circulated. Using the 8:36 a.m. chart, Matty's Apophis conjuncts her descendant. If we use the 5:17 a.m. chart, his Apophis conjuncts her vertex. So the house structure changes, but Apophis still lands on an extremely sensitive parts in her chart. And I need to talk about Apophis. Apophis is the great serpent of chaos. In Egyptian mythology, Apophis represents disruption, destruction, and the force that threatens to throw order into chaos. And in my work with this asteroid, I've also seen Apophis show up around disappearance and ghosting. Either way, his Apophis is activated. The Serpent of Chaos is sitting on one of Taylor's sensitive relationship or encounter points, the vertex. And we know how this relationship ended. He disappeared. And then I found another asteroid conjunct Taylor's descendant that really caught my attention. Matty's Impala conjuncts her descendant at 0 degrees. Impala carries the symbolism of sudden escape, running free, fleeing, bolting away. Think about the animal itself. An impala doesn't stand there and negotiate with danger. When that instinct gets triggered, it runs. And this is exactly on Taylor's descendant, the angle associated with partnership and significant relationships. So now look at what we're getting. His Apophis brings chaos and disruption into her relationship axes, and his Impala, exact at 0 degrees, brings the symbolism of escape. That's pretty striking considering what actually happened between them. This relationship didn't slowly fade away over a long period of time. He bolted. Now, this is really interesting because we have her Atropos conjunct his north node at 0 degrees. Atropos is one of the 3 fates. Clotho spins the thread of life, Lachesis measures it, and Atropos is the one who cuts the thread. She represents the ending, the moment when something has run its course and the thread is severed. The North Node represents the road ahead, the destiny and the theme of the relationship. So Taylor comes into his path carrying Atropos, the cutter of the thread. And remember what we saw earlier. Her Agapanor is on his south node. And this means she would help him move from one chapter of his life into another. And now, on the opposite end of that nodal axis, we find Atropos. So Taylor may have been part of the bridge between chapters, but she also carries the symbolism of the ending of that chapter and the relationship as well. And this is exact, 0 degrees. Now, his iota conjuncts her north node within 2 degrees. And iota is fascinating here because the word literally refers to something extremely small, a tiny amount. That's where we get the expression, not 1 iota. And look where his iota falls, on her north node, the destiny and theme of the relationship for her. And I can't ignore the irony here, because she would later write a song widely associated with this relationship called The Smallest Man Who Ever Lived. You really can't make this up. Because whatever emotional impact this relationship ultimately had on her, the relationship itself was tiny in terms of actual time. And Iota isn't the only asteroid he puts on her north node. His Orpheus is there too. And Orpheus has one of the great love and loss stories in mythology. Orpheus loses Eurydice and is given one chance to bring her back from the underworld. There's only one condition. He cannot look back at her until they've reached the world above. But at the last moment, he looks back, and then he loses her again. So Orpheus carries this extraordinary symbolism of love followed by loss, and it centers around the person you cannot ultimately keep. But Orpheus also symbolizes deep grief, longing, and artistic and musical inspiration. And there's another piece of this mythology that is fascinating. Orpheus was a poet and a musician. So this symbolism fits remarkably well with what came afterward. Taylor taking this brief, painful relationship and turning that loss and longing into music and poetry on the tortured poets department. So on her north node, the destiny and theme of this relationship, Matty brings her 2 asteroids. Iota, something tiny, something brief. And Orpheus, a love story that ends in loss and grief, but then becomes art, music, and poetry. This relationship may have occupied only a tiny piece of her life, but that doesn't mean it left a tiny emotional footprint. Now, his Fama conjuncts her sun. Fama represents fame and publicity. And these asteroids are sitting directly on her sun, which is Taylor herself. So I have to ask the question, was part of his connection with her somehow tied to the enormous fame and publicity surrounding her? I'm not saying that's why he became involved with her, but when I see fame sitting on her sun, I'm certainly going to notice it. Because intentional or not, being connected to Taylor Swift put an enormous spotlight on him. And there's one major planetary aspect here that I want to go over. Her Pluto opposes his moon. The moon is our emotional world. It's where we're vulnerable. And he has his moon in Taurus. A Taurus moon wants stability. It wants solid ground underneath its feet. It wants to know where it stands emotionally. Pluto doesn't do anything halfway. It intensifies. It exposes and digs underneath the surface and brings buried emotions up with it. So she could have stirred up feelings that were far more intense and destabilizing than his Taurus moon was comfortable with. But Pluto opposing her moon may help explain what he was escaping from. Maybe he didn't disappear because there was nothing there. Maybe he disappeared because whatever was there became more emotionally intense that he wanted to deal with. Another major contact here that I don't want to overlook. His Chiron conjuncts her moon. A Chiron conjunction to the moon can be incredibly sensitive in synastry because the moon represents our emotional needs, our vulnerability, and the part of us that needs to feel emotionally safe. This can create tremendous emotional sensitivity between two people, but it can also mean that the Chiron person, which is him, touches emotional wounds in her that are already very tender. And I've seen strong moon-Chiron contacts show up in relationships that become deeply painful when they break apart suddenly. And in this chart, we already have Apophis bringing chaos, Impala showing the escape, and Atropos cutting the cord. So, Chiron adds that final piece to their story. He didn't just leave. His departure left a wound. I will be back soon with more synastry charts.